The lights above the platform burned white, and I could not look away. Elena Voss stood at the center of that platform, hands bound behind her back, her uniform still pressed and clean, as if she had dressed that morning expecting a normal day of talks. She was not crying. She was not shaking. She looked out at the cameras, out at every screen across 100 worlds, and she looked calm. I was 20 meters away, behind a wall of guards who would not let me move, would not let me speak, would not let me do anything but watch. My name is Daniel Ashford, and on that day I was nothing more than a junior aide, the youngest member of the human delegation to the Kryzari Dominion. I had been sent along to carry files and pour water at meetings. I had never expected to carry a memory like this one. The Kryzari commander standing beside Elena was called Threl Vantak, a tall figure with gray-plated skin and eyes like polished stone. He spoke slowly, in a translated voice that echoed across the chamber, accusing the ambassador of crimes she did not commit. A border violation, a spying charge, words built out of nothing, stacked together until they sounded almost real if you did not know better. I knew better. Everyone in that room knew better. It did not matter. This broadcast was going out live to every corner of explored space. Billions of eyes from a dozen species were watching. The Kryzari wanted a show. They wanted the galaxy to see what happened when a small new species dared to disagree with them at the negotiating table. Humanity had only joined the wider galactic community a few years earlier, and to the Kryzari, we were an easy target. Weak, loud, unable to defend ourselves out here among the stars. Elena had spent the last 3 months trying to broker a peace agreement between the Kryzari Dominion and a smaller species called the Orlanai, whose home system bordered Kryzari territory. She believed in the mission. She used to tell me, over late dinners in the embassy, that words could stop wars before they started, if enough people were brave enough to say them. Now they were taking her words away forever. I remember the sound of my own heartbeat more than I remember what Threl Vantak actually said. I remember thinking, this cannot be real. Someone will stop this. Someone will step in. No one stepped in. The guards around me stood still as statues. The other alien delegates in the viewing gallery watched with expressions I could not read, some curious, some indifferent, a few almost pleased. Elena turned her head, just slightly, and for one moment her eyes found mine across that vast chamber. She did not look afraid. She looked like she was giving me an instruction, though she said nothing at all. I have thought about that look every day since. Then it was over. There was a flash of light from the device behind her, quick and silent, and Elena Voss, ambassador of the human race to the Kryzari Dominion, was gone. The broadcast cut to static for exactly 4 seconds before switching back to Threl Vantak, who raised a hand toward the cameras and declared that this was what happened to those who threatened the peace of the Dominion. I do not remember being taken out of that chamber. I do not remember the walk back to our shuttle. The next clear memory I have is sitting in a small gray room aboard the transport ship that would carry the remaining human staff back toward Earth, staring at a wall, waiting for something inside me to break. It never did. Instead, something else happened. Something I did not understand until much later. Silence. Not my silence. Earth's silence. Within an hour of the broadcast, every human channel across Kryzari space went dark. No statements. No protests. No demands for justice. The usual noise of human diplomacy. The arguments. The press conferences. The outraged speeches that other species had grown used to hearing from us. All of it simply stopped, as if someone had reached out and turned off a switch. I sat on that ship and listened to the crew talk in hushed voices, wondering the same thing everyone across the galaxy was wondering. Where was the anger? Where was the outrage? The Kryzari had expected fury. They had expected threats they could use as an excuse to strike first and call it self-defense. That was the entire plan. Provoke humanity into acting rashly, then crush us, while the rest of the galaxy watched and learned not to challenge the Dominion. Instead, there was nothing. I remember a young communications officer named Grace Whitfield walking past my seat, her tablet glowing in her hand, her face pale. She stopped, looked at me, and said quietly that Earth had gone into a full communications blackout. Every outbound channel from our homeworld to the rest of the galaxy had been cut. Even the diplomatic hotlines used for emergencies were silent. I asked her what that meant. She did not answer. I do not think she knew either. The ship traveled for days through the dark spaces between stars, and during that time I kept replaying the broadcast in my mind, over and over, searching for some detail that might explain what I had seen, some sign that Elena had known this was coming. I remembered small things, the way she had asked me, only 2 days before the broadcast, to make sure certain files were sent home through a private channel, not through the usual embassy system, the way she had told me, almost in passing, that if anything ever happened to her, I should trust that Earth already knew what to do. At the time I thought she was simply being careful, the way diplomats often are. Now I wondered if she had known something the rest of us did not. Other species began reacting to the silence before we even arrived home. I watched news feeds from a dozen different worlds, translated hastily by the ship's systems, all asking the same question in different languages. Why is humanity not responding? Some analysts believed we were too frightened to act, a young species overwhelmed by grief and unable to organize a response. Others believed our government had simply collapsed under the shock, unable to agree on what to do next. A few, a very few, said something different. They said that humanity's silence did not feel like weakness. It felt like something else, something colder. I did not understand what they meant, not yet. I only knew that the silence followed me everywhere, through every corridor of that ship, through every meal I forced myself to eat, through every hour of sleep I could not find. It was not comfortable. It felt like standing in a room and knowing, without being told, that something enormous was moving just beyond the walls, quiet and patient and utterly certain of itself. When we finally reached Earth, I expected chaos. I expected crowds in the streets, angry speeches from world leaders, funeral broadcasts honoring Elena as a martyr. Instead, the transport ship was met by a small group of officials in plain uniforms, none of whom smiled, none of whom offered condolences in the way I had expected. They simply told me and the rest of the surviving staff to gather our belongings and follow them. I was taken to a facility I did not recognize, far from the usual government buildings I had visited before leaving for the Kryzari system. The halls were quiet in a way that felt deliberate, not empty from neglect, but empty because every unnecessary sound had been stripped away, as if the entire building was holding its breath. An officer I did not know met me at a set of secure doors. He introduced himself only by his surname, Marsh, and told me that my testimony would be needed, that everything I remembered from the broadcast and the days before it mattered now more than I could understand. I asked him what was happening. Why had Earth gone silent? Why had no one condemned the Kryzari, demanded justice, done anything at all that the rest of the galaxy could see? He looked at me for a long moment before answering, and his voice was calm in a way that unsettled me more than shouting would have. He said that humanity had not gone silent because we had nothing to say. We had gone silent because we were done talking. I did not understand what he meant. I only knew, standing in that quiet hallway with the weight of Elena's final glance still pressing on my chest, that something had already begun, something far larger than a single broadcast, something the rest of the galaxy had not yet noticed and would not be ready for when they finally did. Behind those secure doors, I would soon learn just how wrong every other species in the galaxy had been about us. Officer Marsh led me through the secure doors into a room with no windows, only screens, dozens of them, covering every wall from floor to ceiling. Each screen showed a different feed, some from Earth's own defense networks, others clearly intercepted from alien broadcasts, translated in real time by systems I had never seen before. I stood there for a moment, overwhelmed, trying to understand why a junior diplomatic aide had been brought into a room like this. Marsh must have seen the confusion on my face because he said, without much warmth, that Elena Voss had personally requested, months earlier, that if anything ever happened to her, I be included in the follow-up briefings. I did not know what to say to that. I had been her aide for less than a year. I poured her coffee. I carried her files. I did not think she had noticed me the way that request suggested. He did not give me time to think about it further. He walked me to a long table, where a woman named Grace Whitfield, the same communications officer I had seen aboard the transport ship, was already seated, surrounded by data slates and a small holographic display. She looked up when I entered and gave me a short nod, the kind of nod people give each other when they already know they are about to share something difficult. Grace explained that in the hours since the broadcast, Earth's government had not been silent out of confusion or fear. It had been silent because every available resource, every department, every agency, had shifted immediately into a single coordinated effort. She called it, simply, the response. I asked what the response actually was. She hesitated, glancing at Marsh, who gave a small nod of approval before she continued. She told me that decades earlier, when humanity first made contact with the wider galaxy, and realized how vast and dangerous that community truly was, our leaders had studied every species we encountered. They studied how each empire behaved, how each government made decisions, how each culture measured strength and weakness. What they found was troubling. Species like the Krizari respected only two things: overwhelming power, and the willingness to use it without hesitation. Anything less than that, any show of anger without immediate and total follow-through, was read as weakness, an invitation to be tested again and again. Human diplomats, Grace explained, are naturally expressive. We raise our voices, we protest, we hold press conferences, we argue in public. It is simply how we are built. But those instincts, if left unchecked, would make us look exactly like the emotional, unpredictable, weak species that older empires already assumed us to be. So a decision had been made, quietly, years before I was ever assigned to the embassy. If a moment ever came when the Krizari, or any other power, crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, humanity would not respond with words at all. We would respond with total, coordinated, silent preparation, and only after that preparation was complete would the rest of the galaxy learn what had happened. They called it, informally, the quiet answer. I sat with that information for a long moment, trying to understand the scale of what she was describing. I asked her plainly whether that meant Earth was preparing for war. Grace did not flinch from the question. She said that war had already been declared the moment Elena Voss was executed on that platform. The only question now was how, and when, and on what terms humanity would choose to fight it. Over the following days, I was given limited access to briefings that showed me pieces of what was happening across our worlds. I saw shipyards in orbit around Earth and Mars running at capacities I did not know we possessed, hulls being completed in a fraction of the time official reports had ever admitted was possible. I saw veterans, men and women who had left military service years earlier, quietly returning to bases without any public announcement. I saw supply lines shifting, resources being redirected, entire industries adjusting overnight without a single press release explaining why. None of it appeared on any public news channel. None of it reached the alien networks monitoring our world for signs of retaliation. To any outside observer watching Earth from orbit, everything looked calm, almost eerily normal. Streets were quiet. Markets functioned. Public statements from our leaders offered only careful, measured words about mourning the loss of a respected diplomat and reviewing our options going forward. Reviewing our options. That was the phrase used again and again, vague enough to reveal nothing, calm enough to suggest exactly the passive weakness the Krizari wanted to see. I began to understand, slowly, that this calm was not real. It was a mask, deliberately built and carefully maintained, hiding an enormous machine that had already begun turning beneath the surface. Marsh brought me into another briefing a week after my arrival, this one focused on the political landscape beyond human space. Analysts had been tracking reactions from other species since the execution, and the picture they described surprised me. Many of the smaller, weaker civilizations that had suffered under Krizari expansion for generations were watching Earth closely, waiting to see what we would do. Some of them had reached out through private, unofficial channels, testing whether humanity might be open to quiet alliances, provided we were willing to actually act rather than simply protest. Grace explained that these approaches were being handled carefully, without any public acknowledgement, because revealing them too early could give the Krizari time to prepare or retaliate against those smaller species before humanity was ready to support them. Every conversation, every agreement, was happening in shadow, exactly as the broader response demanded. I asked her how long this could continue before someone noticed. She told me the honest answer was that no one really knew. Every day of silence bought more time for shipyards to finish their work, for alliances to solidify, for the pieces to fall into place. But every day also carried risk, because the Krizari were not foolish. Eventually they would begin to wonder why the loud, emotional species they had just humiliated on a galaxy-wide broadcast had said nothing at all in response. That risk became real about 10 days after the execution. Grace called me into the briefing room early one morning, her expression tighter than I had seen it before. She showed me an intercepted transmission from a Chrysari intelligence officer speaking to a superior, translated and subtitled across the bottom of the screen. The officer expressed growing unease about humanity's continued silence, describing it as unnatural, describing our species as normally impossible to quiet for more than a few hours at a time. His superior dismissed the concern, insisting that humanity was simply broken, too weak and disorganized to respond at all. But the officer pressed further, saying something that stayed with me long after the recording ended. He said that in his experience, every species goes silent before doing one of two things: surrendering completely, or preparing to strike in a way they cannot take back. I asked Grace whether the Chrysari believed we had surrendered. She told me that most of their command structure did, and that this belief was exactly what humanity needed them to hold on to for as long as possible. During those weeks, I also learned more about Elena Voss than I had known while working beside her. Marsh showed me personnel records, communications logs, and personal notes she had filed with Earth's diplomatic corps, long before her final mission to the Chrysari Dominion. She had requested that particular posting herself, aware of the tension building along the Chrysari border, aware that the odds of a peaceful resolution were shrinking with every passing month. In one of her final private messages, sent only hours before the broadcast, she had written a short note, intended for Earth's command structure, not for public release. I was allowed to read it once, under supervision, and I have never forgotten her words. She wrote that if the Chrysari chose to cross the line, that could not be uncrossed, Earth should not waste a single moment mourning her in public. She asked instead that we let our actions speak entirely for themselves, and that we make sure the rest of the galaxy understood, without any doubt, exactly what it meant to threaten a species that had learned long ago never to make a promise it did not intend to keep. Reading those words, I finally understood the look she had given me in that final moment on the platform. She had not been asking me to grieve, she had been asking me to trust what came next. By the end of that month, the quiet preparations Grace had described to me were no longer theoretical. I was given clearance to observe a live status report delivered to Earth's highest command, a room full of officials and military leaders speaking in calm, measured tones about fleet readiness, alliance commitments, and coordinated timing across a dozen different fronts. There was no anger in that room. There was no shouting, no dramatic declarations, no speeches meant to inspire. There was only quiet, focused certainty, the kind that comes from people who have already made their decision and are simply working through the details of how best to carry it out. I sat at the edge of that room, still the same junior aide who had once poured water at diplomatic meetings, and I understood at last what Marsh had meant during our first conversation. Humanity had not gone silent because we had nothing left to say. We had gone silent because every word that mattered had already been spoken, months and years earlier, in quiet policies and careful plans that the rest of the galaxy had never bothered to notice. The Chrysari had expected grief, or anger, or fear. What they were about to receive instead was something far more dangerous, something built patiently in the dark, while the whole galaxy assumed we had simply gone quiet out of weakness. I did not know yet exactly what form that response would take. But sitting in that room, listening to calm voices plan the next steps of a war that had already begun, I understood one thing with absolute certainty. The silence was almost over, and when it finally broke, the entire galaxy would learn exactly what kind of mistake the Chrysari Dominion had made. It was Grace who finally gave me access to the full record of what Elena Voss had built before her death, and I remember sitting alone in a small reading room with a single data slate, realizing for the first time just how much I had never known about the woman I worked for. Elena had joined the diplomatic corps almost 20 years earlier, long before most of the current staff had even considered a career among the stars. She was not simply a negotiator. She had trained early in her career, alongside Earth's Strategic Command, learning how military planning and diplomacy fit together, understanding that words alone rarely stopped a determined enemy, and that real peace often depended on the credible threat of consequences no one wanted to face. In her private files, I found something called the Silence Protocol, a policy document drafted decades earlier and quietly updated every few years since. I was permitted to read only a summary, but even that summary was enough to change the way I understood everything that had happened since the broadcast. The protocol was built on a simple observation, one that Elena herself had helped refine during her years of service. Every major species humanity had encountered judged strength differently, but nearly all of them judged weakness the same way. A government that reacted to loss with noise, outrage, and empty threats was a government that could be pushed, tested, and eventually broken. A government that reacted to loss with total silence, followed by sudden and overwhelming action, was a government that could never be safely provoked again. The protocol stated plainly that any lethal act carried out against an accredited human ambassador, carried out deliberately and without just cause, would not be treated as an insult, requiring a formal complaint or a demand for apology. It would be treated as an act of war, full and complete, requiring no further declaration, no ultimatum, and no negotiation. The document even included a phrase that Elena had apparently insisted on herself, one that Grace quoted to me directly during one of our final briefings together. It read that humanity does not warn its enemies twice. It offers peace once, clearly and honestly, and if that peace is answered with violence against those sent to protect it, the only remaining answer is decisive and final action. I asked Grace how long Elena had known this protocol might apply to her personally. She told me that Elena had requested her posting to the Krizari Dominion, fully aware of the risk, understanding that tensions along that border were already dangerously high, and understanding that if the Krizari ever decided to test humanity's resolve, an ambassador's life might be the price of proving exactly how serious that resolve truly was. That realization struck me harder than almost anything else I learned during those weeks. Elena had not simply been unlucky. She had walked into that posting with her eyes open, aware that her death, if it came, would not be a tragedy without purpose. It would be the exact trigger required to set humanity's full response into motion, a response she had helped design years before she ever set foot on the platform where she died. I spent the following days reviewing recordings of her final months at the embassy, searching for any sign of what she must have been carrying quietly beneath her calm, professional exterior. I found small moments I had missed at the time. A private conversation with Marsh, recorded months earlier, in which she asked pointed questions about fleet readiness timelines and alliance negotiations with smaller species along the Krizari border. A message to Earth's command structure, requesting that certain classified files be released only under specific conditions. Conditions that I now understood had already been met. I also found something I had not expected. A short recorded message, addressed directly to me, filed only days before the broadcast, set to be delivered automatically, if her diplomatic status was ever terminated through hostile action. Marsh allowed me to view it alone. Elena's face appeared on the screen, calm as always, sitting at her desk in the embassy office I remembered so clearly. She said that if I was watching this message, it meant the worst outcome had happened, and that she was sorry to place this burden on someone so young. She said she had chosen me, not because I was the most experienced member of her staff, but because she had watched me carefully during our time together and believed I understood something important, that real strength rarely needs to announce itself. She told me that my task now was simple. I was to trust the process that had already been set in motion, to answer every question asked of me honestly and completely, and to remember, whenever I doubted what was happening, that her death had never been meaningless. It had been the final piece required to prove to the Krizari Dominion, and to every other power watching from the shadows, that humanity's patience was not weakness, and that our silence, when it finally came, would never again be mistaken for surrender. The recording ended there. I sat alone in that reading room for a long time afterward, unable to speak, finally understanding the full weight of the look she had given me across that execution chamber. In the days that followed, Marsh and Grace began including me in higher-level briefings, treating me less like a junior aide and more like someone who needed to understand the full scope of what was coming. I learned that Earth's command structure had spent the weeks since the execution, finalizing agreements with several smaller species along the Krizari border, including the Orlani, whose peace talks Elena had been overseeing at the time of her death. These species had suffered under Krizari expansion for generations, losing territory, resources, and countless lives to a dominion that viewed them as lesser powers unworthy of true diplomacy. Humanity's quiet outreach, conducted entirely outside public channels, offered these smaller species something they had never been given before, a genuine partnership built on mutual defense, rather than one-sided submission. In exchange for their support and cooperation, Earth promised not empty words but concrete action, timed precisely to strike at the moment the Krizari Dominion least expected any organized resistance at all. I watched recordings of Krizari internal communications intercepted during this period, and the contrast was striking. Their leadership continued to describe humanity as broken, cowardly, and disorganized, congratulating themselves on having successfully intimidated a dangerous new species into permanent silence. Some officers argued for further pressure, suggesting additional demonstrations of strength against human interests to reinforce the lesson already taught. Others, a smaller group, expressed growing unease, unable to explain why a species known throughout the galaxy for loud emotional reactions had suddenly gone completely quiet, without a single public statement of protest. One particular exchange stayed with me long after I first heard it. A junior Krizari officer, reviewing years of historical data on human behavior, noted that in every recorded conflict throughout our short history among the stars, humanity had always responded to provocation with immediate, visible outrage. He argued that the complete absence of any such reaction now was not consistent with weakness, but with something far more calculated, something his superiors seemed unwilling to consider. His warning was dismissed. I later learned that officer's name, Threl Kovacs, would become important again much later, though at the time, he was simply a voice of caution, ignored by a command structure too confident in its own assumptions. As the weeks progressed, I was given a clearer picture of exactly what humanity's full response would involve. It was not, as I had first imagined, a single dramatic strike meant to shock the galaxy. It was something far more methodical. Supply lines feeding Krizari military operations along contested borders would be quietly disrupted. Communication networks used to coordinate their forces would be identified and prepared for disabling at a precise, coordinated moment. Alliances with smaller species would ensure that when humanity finally acted, we would not be acting alone, and the Krizari would find themselves facing resistance on multiple fronts simultaneously, exactly when their attention and resources were already stretched thin. Grace explained that the entire plan depended on timing and patience, two things she said humanity had rarely been given credit for possessing. Every additional week of silence allowed another ship to complete construction, another alliance to solidify, another piece of the response to fall quietly into place. The Krizari's own arrogance, their certainty that our silence meant surrender, was working directly in our favor, buying time that could never have been secured through open confrontation. I asked Marsh, during one of our final briefings before events accelerated further, whether he believed the Krizari would ever understand what had truly happened, or whether they would go on believing, right up until the end, that they had successfully broken humanity's spirit through a single public execution. He told me that understanding was not something an enemy needed to be given freely. It was something they needed to earn, through consequences severe enough to teach a lesson they would never forget. He said that Elena Voss had understood this lesson better than almost anyone in the diplomatic corps, and that her final act, whether she had intended it this way or not, had ensured the Krizari Dominion would soon learn it as well, in a manner far more permanent than any words could ever have achieved. Sitting in that briefing room, surrounded by calm, focused officials preparing for a response, built patiently over years of careful planning, I finally understood the true purpose of the silence protocol Elena had helped create. It was never meant to hide fear or uncertainty. It was meant to buy exactly the kind of time required to turn a moment of tragedy into an answer so complete that no other power in the galaxy would ever again mistake human patience for human weakness. The silence, I realized, had never been an absence of action. It had been the quiet, careful construction of consequences too large to survive. The order finally came on a morning that looked exactly like every other morning that had passed since the execution, and that was precisely the point. I was aboard a human command vessel by then, brought along not as a soldier but as a witness, someone Marsh insisted needed to see the response through to its conclusion after everything I had learned in the weeks before. The ship was called the Meridian, a name I would remember for the rest of my life, quiet and steady as it moved through the dark, alongside a fleet larger than anything I had known Earth possessed. Colonel Owen Marsh stood at the center of the command deck, calm as always, watching a series of screens that displayed positions across dozens of systems at once. Grace Whitfield worked beside him, coordinating communications with allied forces from the Orlani and several other smaller species who had agreed, weeks earlier and entirely in secret, to move the moment humanity gave the signal. There were no speeches before it began, no dramatic countdown, no rallying words broadcast to the crew. Marsh simply gave a single quiet order, and across a dozen different fronts, months of careful preparation finally became action. I watched on the screens as Krizari supply routes, mapped in detail over weeks of quiet intelligence work, were cut off almost simultaneously. Convoys carrying fuel and resources to their border fleets found their paths blocked or redirected by forces they had not known were positioned nearby. Communication relays that the Krizari depended on to coordinate their scattered military units went dark one after another, disabled with a precision that left their command structure suddenly unable to speak clearly to its own forces. Grace explained to me, as the operation unfolded, that the goal was never to strike at civilian populations or unnecessary targets. Every action had been chosen carefully, aimed only at the military infrastructure that allowed the Krizari Dominion to project power and enforce its will over smaller, weaker species. It was, she said, exactly the kind of careful, restrained action Elena Voss had always believed in, even as she had helped design the very protocol that made such overwhelming action possible. Across several border systems, ships bearing the markings of the Orlani and other allied species moved openly for the first time, no longer forced to hide their cooperation with humanity. For years, these smaller powers had watched the Krizari Dominion expand unchecked, absorbing territory and resources, while the rest of the galaxy looked away, unwilling to challenge a power so much larger than themselves. Now, with humanity's coordinated support finally revealed, they moved with a confidence I had not seen in any of the earlier intercepted transmissions describing their people. I watched a live feed from one of the border systems as an Orlani fleet, working alongside human support ships, reclaimed a series of outposts the Krizari had taken years earlier. There was no ceremony to it, no dramatic victory speech. It happened efficiently, almost quietly, exactly the way Marsh had described the entire operation would unfold from the very beginning. Back on the Meridian, I asked Grace how the Krizari command structure was responding to an attack they clearly had not anticipated. She showed me an intercepted transmission from a senior Krizari officer, his voice tight with confusion, as he demanded updates from subordinates who could no longer reach him through channels that had worked reliably for years. He kept repeating the same question, asking why humanity had not issued any warning, any demand, any statement explaining what was happening, or what it would take to make it stop. There was no answer for him, because humanity had not come to negotiate. We had come to finish something the Krizari themselves had started the moment they chose to execute an ambassador on a broadcast meant to intimidate the entire galaxy. I later learned that the officer I had first heard mentioned weeks earlier, Threl Kovacs, the one who had warned his superiors that humanity's silence might mean something far more dangerous than surrender, was among those scrambling to respond as the operation unfolded. Unlike many of his colleagues, he had spent the weeks of silence preparing contingency plans of his own, quietly advising his local command to strengthen defenses along key supply routes, even as his warnings were largely ignored by leadership convinced humanity posed no further threat. When the attack came, his preparations meant his sector suffered less immediate damage than others, though even he had not anticipated the full scale and precision of what humanity had built in secret. I watched a recording, obtained later through Allied intelligence channels, of Kovacs standing in a command center surrounded by officers struggling to understand how an enemy they had dismissed as broken had managed to coordinate an assault across so many fronts at once, without a single warning shot fired in the weeks leading up to it. Kovacs said something in that recording that I have never forgotten. He told his subordinates that they had made the same mistake every empire eventually makes when facing a species it does not fully understand. They had judged humanity by its loudest moments, its arguments and protests and public displays of emotion, without ever considering what such a species might be capable of once it decided those displays no longer served a purpose. Silence, he said, was not the absence of a plan. It was often the clearest sign that a plan had already been finished. His warning came too late to change the outcome, though it did earn him a measure of respect among the human command staff, who later reviewed the recording, including Marsh himself, who remarked quietly that at least one officer among the Krizari had understood what the rest of his leadership refused to see. Over the following days, the operation continued to unfold across multiple fronts, each move carefully timed to build on the success of those before it. Krizari forces, cut off from reliable communication and reinforcement, found themselves increasingly unable to coordinate an effective response. Smaller species who had lived for years under Krizari pressure began openly declaring their support for the growing coalition led by Earth, no longer willing to hide their allegiance, now that humanity had proven itself capable of decisive, coordinated action, rather than empty words. I watched from the Meridian as news of the operation finally reached the wider galaxy, no longer able to be hidden or ignored by any observer paying attention. Other major powers, species who had watched the execution broadcast months earlier and quietly wondered whether humanity would ever respond, now saw the answer unfolding in real time across a dozen different systems. The silence that had once been read as weakness was now understood, far too late for the Krizari to benefit from that understanding, as the quiet construction of an answer too large and too precise to survive. Marsh allowed me to send a single message during that period, addressed to no one in particular, meant only for the official historical record humanity would eventually compile from these events. I did not know what to write at first. Eventually I simply recorded a short statement describing what I had witnessed since the day of the execution, the silence that followed, the careful preparation I had slowly come to understand, and the moment when that preparation finally became action. I ended that recording with a single line I had been thinking about since Elena's final message to me, a line I believed captured exactly what the Krizari Dominion had failed to understand about the species they had chosen to provoke. Humanity does not answer cruelty with noise. We answer it with patience, and when that patience finally runs out, we answer it completely. As the operation entered its final phase, reports began reaching the Meridian that senior Krizari leadership, faced with mounting losses across nearly every contested front and the collapse of alliances they had long taken for granted, were beginning to discuss terms of surrender rather than continued resistance. Grace told me that Earth's command structure had anticipated this moment as well, preparing a clear and specific set of demands months in advance, ensuring that when the time came to negotiate an end to the conflict, humanity would not be caught unprepared or forced into hurried decisions. I stood on the command deck of the Meridian as those final reports came in, watching Marsh review them with the same calm focus he had shown throughout the entire operation. I asked him whether this meant the response Elena had helped design was finally complete. He told me that it was not quite finished, not yet. There remained one final matter to address, one that the entire galaxy would be watching closely, and one that would determine, more than any military victory could, exactly how the rest of known space would remember what humanity had chosen to do in answer to the execution of Elena Voss. The final matter Marsh had spoken of turned out to be a meeting, though unlike any diplomatic meeting I had attended before. It was held aboard a neutral station overseen by representatives of the wider Galactic Concord, the loose collection of species that governed relations between the many powers of known space. Humanity had requested this meeting the moment Krizari leadership formally agreed to discuss terms, and unlike the silence we had maintained for months, this time we intended to be heard clearly by every species watching. I was permitted to attend as part of the human delegation, standing near the back of the chamber alongside Grace, while Marsh took a seat at the negotiating table beside several senior officials I recognized only from briefing recordings. Across from them sat a reduced Krizari delegation, led not by Threll Vantak, the officer who had ordered Elena's execution, but by a quieter, more cautious figure who introduced himself simply as a representative of what remained of the Dominion's central leadership. I learned, before the meeting began, that Vantak himself had already been removed from any position of authority within the Krizari command structure. Whether this had happened through internal political pressure following the disastrous outcome of his decision, or through more direct means demanded as part of humanity's private terms for negotiation, I was never told with complete certainty. Grace only said, quietly, that some questions were better left unasked, and that the important outcome was that he would never again hold power capable of threatening another species the way he had threatened us. The negotiations themselves were far less dramatic than I had expected, after everything I had witnessed in the preceding months. Humanity's representatives spoke calmly and clearly, laying out terms that were firm, but not needlessly cruel. Krizari forces were required to withdraw from all territory taken by force from smaller species along the border, including the systems belonging to the Orlani, whose peace talks Elena had once been trying so carefully to broker. Reparations were demanded, not as punishment alone, but as a clear signal to every other power watching that actions taken against the innocent would always carry a cost too significant to ignore. Perhaps most importantly, the terms required that any future dispute involving human personnel, whether diplomatic, military, or civilian, be handled through established channels of communication and law, never again through unilateral violence disguised as justice. It was a demand aimed not simply at preventing another tragedy like Elena's death, but at ensuring that the very idea of publicly executing a diplomat to intimidate a rival power would never again be considered an acceptable strategy by any government watching these proceedings unfold. I watched the Chrysari representative accept these terms with visible reluctance, though he offered little argument against them. His people had little leverage left to bargain with. Not after months of coordinated pressure had dismantled so much of their military advantage and exposed the fragility of alliances they had assumed would last forever. Other species present in that chamber, representatives from dozens of worlds who had spent generations watching the Chrysari dominion expand largely unchallenged, observed the proceedings with expressions that ranged from quiet satisfaction to open astonishment. After the formal terms were finalized, several delegates from smaller, previously uninvolved species approached the human delegation directly, something that had rarely happened during my earlier years working at the embassy. I overheard more than one representative express surprise, not simply at humanity's military capability, but at the patience and discipline we had shown throughout the entire process. One elderly delegate, from a species I did not recognize, told Grace directly that humanity had earned something in those months that could not be purchased through strength alone. Respect built not on fear, but on demonstrated restraint, paired with undeniable capability. In the weeks that followed the formal end of hostilities, I returned briefly to Earth, before being reassigned to a new diplomatic posting, one considerably more senior than the position I had held before Elena's death. I did not feel entirely ready for that responsibility, though Marsh assured me, during our final conversation before I departed, that readiness was rarely something anyone felt completely certain of before stepping into difficult roles. He told me that Elena herself had likely felt the same uncertainty when she first requested her posting to the Chrysari Dominion, and that what mattered most was not the absence of doubt, but the willingness to act with integrity despite it. Before leaving Earth, I visited the memorial that had been built in Elena's honor, a quiet garden near the Diplomatic Academy, where new generations of ambassadors would soon begin their training. Her name was engraved on a simple stone marker, along with a short passage taken from her private files, one that Earth's government had chosen to release publicly once the conflict finally concluded. It read that true strength is rarely loud, and that the quietest decisions often carry the heaviest consequences. I learned, during a brief conversation with an instructor at the academy, that Elena's final mission and the response that followed her death had already become required study for every new diplomat entering the program. Students were taught not simply the details of what had happened, but the deeper lesson behind it, the understanding that patience and preparation, when combined with genuine restraint, could accomplish far more than anger ever could on its own. I thought often, during those quiet weeks back on Earth, about the look Elena had given me across that execution chamber so many months earlier. I understood now, in a way I could not have at the time, that she had not been asking me to grieve for her, or even simply to trust in a plan she believed would eventually unfold. She had been asking me to understand something about the nature of true strength, something she had spent her entire career trying to embody, and something she had ultimately proven with the very last moments of her life. Humanity had not fallen silent that day because we had nothing left to say. We had fallen silent because everything that truly needed to be said was about to be demonstrated instead, patiently, carefully, and completely, in a way that words alone could never have achieved. Years later, long after I had settled into my new diplomatic role and the memory of that broadcast had faded into a lesson studied by students rather than a wound felt daily by those who had lived through it, I was asked to speak before a gathering of the Galactic Concord about the events that had followed Elena's death. I stood before representatives from dozens of species, many of whom had once doubted humanity's resolve, and I told them plainly what I had come to understand during those long months of silence and careful preparation. I told them that every species in that room measured strength differently, through military power, through economic influence, through cultural reach across the stars. But I told them that humanity had learned something during those difficult months that I believed applied to every civilization capable of listening closely enough to hear it. Silence, when it comes from weakness, is easily broken by the slightest pressure. Silence, when it comes from patient, deliberate preparation, is the quietest and most dangerous warning any power can offer. I closed my remarks that day with words I had carried with me since the moment Elena's final message played on that small screen in a quiet reading room. Words that I believed captured everything that had happened since that terrible broadcast so many years before. Never mistake a moment of silence for surrender. Sometimes it is simply the sound of a decision already made, waiting patiently for the right moment to be revealed. As I stepped away from that podium, I glanced briefly toward a small screen displaying the official record of the Concorde's proceedings, and saw Elena's name listed quietly among the historical references cited for that day's discussion. It was a small detail, easy to overlook, yet it felt, in that moment, like exactly the kind of quiet, lasting recognition she would have wanted far more than any grand memorial or public tribute. Humanity had spoken, in the end, not through anger, but through patience proven complete. And across every corner of the galaxy that had once doubted us, that lesson would not soon be forgotten.